Michael Wolfson is a former assistant chief statistician at StatsCan, a PhD economist. He's also with Ottawa U in the Department of Epidemiology. He's written an interesting new piece on what retirement is going to look like for a number of middle-income earners over the age of 40 today if you use the existing models of the Canada Pension Plan. Now, he begins by talking about Jim Flaherty, the finance minister's reference to pull together the provincial finance ministers and deal with some modest expansions of CPP. And Michael Wolfson admits some of the things he'd like to see may not be so modest. In fact, what he's laid out is a set of recommendations that are not modest at all. So I thought, given the fact that you are the age you are today, and we often have these great discussions about what retirement looks like, we better find Professor Michael Wolfson in Ottawa. Michael, thanks for taking our call.
Well, the pleasure to be with you.
Can you explain for me when, and you were referring to an earlier study you did for the Institute of Research on Public Policy, that about half of middle-income earners over 40 today will see a decline in their standard of living. How do we get to that conclusion as a starting point?
Well, it involves quite a fancy analysis, and I won't go into the details, but we basically looked at the kind of saving that people are doing, not only in their RRSPs or their company pension plans, if they're fortunate enough to have one, but also in, for example, lots of people own a house. And we also looked at the way the government programs are structured, not just the Canada and Quebec pension plans, but also the old age security pension and the GIS and the income tax system for sure, and payroll taxes. And we projected forward not just a typical or representative individual, but a representative sample of the population of Canada. And what we found is that if you sort of net everything out, you say, okay, after tax, after paying your mortgage, after your payroll taxes, after taking account of the fact that your family's bigger when you're of working age and your kids probably have left home by the time you're a senior, we find that over half can expect at least a 25% drop in their standard of living.
So some of the recommendations you're looking at, as Minister Flaherty and his provincial counterparts refer to a modest expansion, you make the argument that a half-century modest solution, of course, is going to take too long. So what are some of the things we start to do that you say perhaps are not so modest but needed?
Well, one of the things is the ministers of finance have not really told anybody, certainly not me or anybody in the public, what they're thinking about. But some of the researchers to whom they refer, I think, talk about a modest expansion being maybe increasing the CPP from, but for people who don't know, it replaces 25% of your gross earnings, bumping that up to 30 and maybe 35%. But part of the plan is that you right now you start contributing that when you're 18. If you don't work, you don't contribute anything, and it takes 47 years till you're 65 until the full benefit of all the contributions you make turn up in benefits. Well, the expansion that's being talked about, or at least I think is being talked about, would similarly take half a century. My, as you call it, and it's in the title of the paper, immodest proposal say let's have a look at something like 40% as the increase, so from 25 to 40%. And what if we phased it in over 20 years rather than waiting 47, almost half a century for it to become fully beneficial?
Okay, so I'm not the economist, you are. So if we went from 25 to 40, we phased it in over 20 years or made it sustainable instead of 47, I'm seeing much higher premiums both by the employee and by the employer.
You're right, and I think there's a good discussion to be had about how much you need to pre-fund all of this. But one of the another of the immodest parts of the proposal I've thrown out, in addition to expanding the CPP, phasing it in more quickly, is also to say for this enlargement of the CPP, let's delay the age at which you can start to draw it. And part of the purpose of using a fancy computer model was so we could do the arithmetic to see where things roughly balance out. And my analysis suggests that between age 68 and age 70, we could do quite a lot without breaking the bank by having an unduly large payroll tax contribution increase.
Now, we're on the way to moving it up now, aren't we? But would your argument be we ought to move more quickly than is being laid out?
Actually, the increase in the Canada Pension Plan contribution rate started in the 1990s and was complete, 7 or 8 years ago. So we're at 9.9% for the employee and the employer combined, or 9.9 if you're self-employed. So that rate is projected by the chief actuary to stay unchanged for the next 30, 40 years.
Okay, sorry, I'm confusing it too, because it was actually OAS, wasn't it? The government moved up.
Oh, you're talking about moving up the age as opposed to the contribution rate. Yeah, the government in the last budget increased the age where you can start getting your old age security and GIS benefit from 65 to 67. It's phased in, but phased in rather quickly. So by 10 or 12 years from now, that'll be the way it works.
Okay, so your proposal would be similarly then CPP to move up to 68 or 70.
Not the existing CPP, only the enlargement part of the CPP.
Okay, got it. So when you start to deal with these proposals, admittedly immodest as they are, is Canada ready for that kind of dialogue?
Well, I sure hope so. When you have the Minister of Finance saying 2 or 3 years ago, Canadians aren't saving enough for retirement, and you look at the data, I'm not, what I've been working on is the projections, but historically there have been, there continue to be lots of people in the middle income ranges. Canada, by the way, is doing really very well indeed amongst OECD countries for the bottom end of the income spectrum with OAS plus GIS. Although that's going to change for 65 and 66-year-olds with the increasing of the age, but. Where was I going? The problems are there with this, and something needs to, there's a consensus, I think, amongst lots of people that the current system is inadequate. In fact, people have been worrying about it for, in my experience, 30 years. When we had the great pension debates back in the early 1980s.
Well, because it was interesting, because I remember when the Canada Pension Plan investment vehicle changed, and there was generally, I think, this conventional view that the existing model was going to be safer. That hasn't changed, but your argument is it simply should be a greater proportion or greater percentage.
Exactly. It is definitely safer and a more secure, as the chief actuary calls it, a sustainable financial footing, but it's also not that big. In terms of gross earnings, it replaces 1/4 of your pre-retirement earnings. Well, you got to add in OAS and GIS and take account of the age credit, so that after tax and all that other stuff, altogether the public pension system, OAS plus GIS plus CPP minus income taxes, is doing better, quite a bit better than 25%, but it's not doing that much more than 50% of replacing for middle income earners what they were getting pre-retirement. Nobody wants to fall off a cliff when they retire. Well, I don't think most people do, but we should have that discussion in public, where their standard of living drops by so much when they stop working.
Michael Wolfson, Ottawa U. Before I let you go, in terms of best practices and the way other publicly administered mandatory pensions work, where does Canada, by our numbers, fit into other countries in the world?
Our replacement rates through the CPP are low by OECD standards.
So 25% is on the low end.
Oh yeah. You compare the Scandinavian countries, I think they're at least double.
Michael, great spending time with you today. Thank you for this.
Well, it's been a pleasure.